Good morning. This is the lecture for week 10, day 2. This should be April 21st if you're following in your syllabus. This is chapters 16 and 17. So we're now in the Romantic period. We found that last class period, Beethoven was the person that transitioned us from that classical period to the Romantic period. If you wanted to give dates to that Romantic period, 1820 to about 1900 would be where you would get most people to agree that it is. So we talked about how this romantic music, or this romantic movement, was a glorification of love that we see going on in literature with Shelley, Keats, Byron. We see it going on in the art world. It's more of, people will call it a cult of individual feelings, that they were striving for a better life, a higher life, more ideal. They thought that everyday life could be dull and meaningless, so they wanted in their work to transcend that with will and with passion. So unconstrained conventions, that's what we talked about last time, that these classical borders or outlines or forms, they're starting to loosen those. They don't want to have to be boxed into a certain form. They don't want religion or social taboos to play into their choices of chords or what type of music they can write or intervals. We see a type of lifestyle that's often referred to as bohemian come about here in the Romantic period. They led irregular lives, wore odd clothes, didn't necessarily have a home base, did a lot of traveling. Think of what we talked about with troubadours and trouvères way back in the Renaissance, those traveling gypsy musicians. And bohemians, some will say it's a familiar vision of what an artist today is too. We also have the Industrial Revolution going on. So we've got a lot of factories, we've got a lot of work conditions that are being improved, we've got a lot of capitalism coming about. All that is going to influence how music is looked at in society and how music is used, how it's patronized by the people that are around. So in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, we talked about, we've got the French Revolution going on in 1789. After that, in 1848, we've got aftershocks that happen in Germany, in France, Austria, Italy. The Romantics are trying to cast a spell, if you will, in the role of these rebels. Many of these musicians are associated with libertarian pursuits, or their politics are very liberal. Beethoven, we talked about that with Napoleon, and Verdi was very involved in the Italian liberation. So the lower and the middle class are gaining more social mobility, and we're going to see that these composers aren't necessarily coming from the top echelon of society either. If you think back to a lot of the Baroque composers, they came from families that were already working for courts or working for churches, or families that were musicians. And we're going to find that these composers in the 19th century, these Romantic composers, were coming from the same class as what they were writing for. So I think that these artistic barriers, they're resisting all the rules and regulations. They don't want to hamper their spontaneity. They don't want to be their drama to be hemmed in by rules. So for instance, in opera, how does this change things? The locations can change from scene to scene instead of the opera being set in one place. We see tragedy, we also see comedy. We see them mixed together. We find that the poetry that is selected is very rich. It does not tend to be bawdry, if you will. The lifelike turbulence, sometimes we can say that you see that reflected even in Shakespeare. Composers are trying to continue on that trend of breaking down the barriers. So with form, with text, with harmony, with chords, things that were previously forbidden is exactly where they're going to go. Sonata form, it's around a lot. It's a hallmark of the classical period, continues to be well used into the Romantic period, but again, expanded, or as we saw in that Beethoven 109 sonata that we just looked at last class period, it can also be miniaturized. So we talked about that with Romantic music. It's not unusual to find the macabre. It's not unusual to find bizarre You can see this in writing with Faust. You can see it with nightmare scenarios. We see it in one of the pieces we're going to look at today by Schubert, which is about a demon pursuing a child. Strange harmonies, sinister sounds, spooky sounds, they're using all this to tell the story. That idea of program music that we talked about last period. So the arts are blending together when you're talking about program music. Poetry, telling the story or leading you through the story instrumentally. Blurred effects, maybe with the chords, ambiguous shapes, ambiguous colors as we blend more instruments together. There's a lot of genres that we're going to see, some that are very popular, some that die out very quickly. Concert life in the 19th century, concert halls and opera houses are still dominated in every city. Every town just about had a symphony. We talked about concert subscriptions being very popular. To give you a time frame, in our country, 1891 was when the New York Symphony was founded, that played at Carnegie Hall. In 1842 was the New York Philharmonic. Even salon music is still popular, that idea of chamber music that was in the home. Some of that is being taken to the stage. We see this with two types in particular, the lieder and the string quartet. So audiences are more conservative. Composers are trying to bring them along on their journey. The public admires composers. They're held in very high esteem. But there starts to be a gap between innovative music that the composers are writing and the conservative public. And that is something that we'll talk a lot about as we get into 20th century music. So with the pieces that we listen to today, melodies more emotional, more exaggerated, not necessarily symmetrical. Harmony, great advances here with new chord progressions, thicker chords, more dissonance. We talked about that with Beethoven. More chromaticism, or using half steps or all 12 tones. There's one term that comes about here that I do want you to pay attention to, and that's the word rubato. So rubato is a romantic tendency to blur the shape of the meter, or to blur the form of that meter. They want the meter to be flexible. They feel that this gives more feeling to it. So instead of my meter being in a strict 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, they will push and pull, still keeping that beat of 4. It's never marked in the score, it's seldom marked in the score. Maybe there might be a word with rubato, but the composer is hoping that the artist or the performer is going to naturally feel that organically in the shape of the line and put that push and pull. Some people like to say, well, would you go so far as to say they're improvising the rhythm? I would say no, but this is definitely something that in the Baroque and Classical period would have been considered very bad taste, to manipulate the composer's meter like that. We're going to hear more lush tone colors. I think that composers start to experiment with more instruments, blending more instruments, again, to give specific sounds, to get that program or that idea or that story across. The orchestra expands to its standard size during the Romantic period. We also see the use of conductors being pretty much the norm. Whereas we've watched a lot of clips, especially of smaller ensembles, where the first violinist would be the one leading it with their bow and with their head. Now you're going to see conductors. The size of our orchestra has grown to such that there needs to be someone in the front. They need to use a baton, which is that white long cylinder, so that they can see, to cue the musicians so that everyone can see them. The conductor's not only there to keep the meter together, but also with the form of soft and loud. So as we get ready to listen to some of the pieces that are on canvas for you today, you're going to notice that the majority of them are program music. So program music, again, means that there's a story that the composer has told you, has given to you, whether it's been written in the program, or it's written on the score, or it's done with titles. There's a story or there's a narrative that goes along with the music that the composer wants you to hear. Program is specific to instrumental music. Word painting, text painting, that's the term we would use for vocal music, where you've got the text or the words telling you the story. So you're going to notice that most of these pieces are program music. So it's not a new idea, but it's gaining more importance in the instrumental world, more prestige. The story is the program. We're also going to see that the form, some forms are larger, some forms are smaller. There's individual spontaneity that's doing this. So some of our forms, we'll call them grandiose, that the composer has made them bigger. Some of the forms we're going to call miniature. So important to remember, in the Romantic period, we see both extremes. We see grandiose and we see miniature. Miniature pieces are mainly chamber pieces, vocal solos with piano, string quartet. Those smaller chamber ensembles are where those miniature compositions are going to come. Those programmatic titles sometimes are given by the composer, sometimes have been given by the publisher. Thematic unity, like we talked about in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, also continues in this Romantic period. Beethoven was one of those ideas that helped carry us into that Romantic. So the theme is there the entire time, whether it's coming through various movements or it's coming through different sections. This is different than what we would call theme and variations. Theme and variations would be one melody, and you keep getting that melody over and over, slightly different each time or varied each time. We've listened to quite a few examples of theme and variation. Thematic unity is when you've got a small motive that is consistently appearing in different ways, different textures, different instruments, throughout multiple movements of a piece. So imaginative, exploratory, spontaneous, these are all words that can pertain to what we're going to hear in the Romantic period.